Hello, my friend. Today I will tell you another long-forgotten legend. Close your eyes and let the magic transport you to Middle-earth. Our journey begins.
In the days before the sun and moon, when the stars were the only lamps upon the sky, Middle-earth was a place of vast, untamed beauty. Great forests stretched endlessly, their canopies sheltering rivers that murmured secrets in the night. Mountains, taller than clouds, stood solemn and unmoving, their peaks kissed only by the light of Varda's stars. It was an age of twilight, of dreams unfurling across the land like mist, and of voices that wove enchantments into the very air. One such voice belonged to Melian, a Maya of the Ainur, who walked unseen in the woods of Middle-earth. Her presence was like the softest breeze that stirred the leaves in quiet groves, like the silver glimmer upon a starlit lake. Wherever she went, the world sighed in wonder, and the trees leaned closer, eager to hear the melodies she sang. For Melian was not a queen of warriors, nor a wielder of weapons. She did not raise fortresses of stone, nor summon armies to war. Her strength was woven into the fabric of the world itself, a presence that bound light and shadow in perfect harmony. And when she sang, even the birds of Manwë paused to listen, their songs falling silent in reverence to hers. It was in these early days that she came to Middle-earth, drawn by a longing she did not fully understand. The land was still young, and though it was beautiful, a shadow lurked in the distant north, a power that did not belong. Melkor, the mightiest of the Valar, had long since turned from the path of light. He had taken upon himself the name Morgoth, and in the depths of the world he wrought terrible things. He built fortresses of black stone and bred creatures of malice in his hidden halls. The world itself trembled beneath his will, and his darkness seeped into the very roots of the earth. But Melian was not afraid. She walked where she pleased, through lands untouched by elves or men, through valleys and glades where time itself seemed to slow. And in the heart of Beleriand, beneath trees whose leaves shimmered like silver, she found a place that called to her spirit. There she lingered, and her presence seeped into the very land. It was there that Doriath was born, not of stone or steel, but of song and enchantment. The creatures of the forest knew her well. The nightingales, her faithful companions, flitted among the branches, their melodies interwoven with hers. The waters of the Escogudwyn, the river that flowed through the hidden woods, carried whispers of her power. The land remembered her touch, and where she walked, flowers of luminous gold blossomed beneath her feet. But Melian was not alone in her wandering. Far away in the lands of the Eldar there was a prince named Elu Thingol, tallest and fairest of the Singar, the Grey Elves. He was noble and wise, his hair silver as moonlight, and his gaze held the weight of ages. Unlike the Noldor, who hungered for knowledge, or the Vanyar, who sought the light of the West, Thingol had chosen to dwell in the lands of Middle-earth, far from the halls of the Valar. His heart belonged to the woods, to the rivers, to the song of the world as it once was. And so it was that fate wove a path for them both. One evening, as the stars bloomed in the sky like white fire, Thingol wandered alone through the forest of Nan Elmoth. It was said that the trees of that wood were unlike any others, tall as towers, their trunks smooth as polished stone, their leaves whispering with voices long forgotten. No light touched that place, save for the glow of the stars above, and the hush of the forest was like the quiet between heartbeats. And then a song, a voice unlike any he had ever heard, drifted through the air, soft as mist, yet rich as the earth after rain. It wrapped around him, calling him forward, pulling him deeper into the grove. He did not know why his feet moved without his bidding, nor why his heart quickened as though he were in a dream. But he followed the song deeper and deeper until he saw her. Melian stood beneath the trees, her dark hair woven with starlight, her robes flowing like the silver rivers of the west. The nightingales sang around her, but their voices were but a shadow of hers. And when her gaze met Thingol's, time itself seemed to stop. The stars above held their breath. The trees ceased their murmuring. Even the river, ever restless, stilled its course. Thingol stepped forward, his voice lost to him, his thoughts scattered like petals on the wind. He had traveled far, seen wonders beyond telling, but never had he beheld something so utterly beyond words. Melian smiled, and in that moment, the fate of Middle-earth changed. For a day and a night they stood as if caught in a spell, neither speaking, neither moving, and when the moment passed, Thingol knew he would never leave her side. His people searched for him, calling his name through the forests, but he did not answer, for he had found something greater than all the wonders of the world. He had found her, and so it was that Melian and Thingol came to rule the land of Doriath, the hidden kingdom, where no darkness could enter. For the power of Melian was woven into its very air, a girdle of enchantment so strong that even Morgoth himself could not pass through its borders. But deep in the north, the Dark Lord watched and knew fear, for he alone understood what few others could, that Melian possessed a power unlike any other, a power that could unmake him. The world seemed to exhale as Thingol and Melian stood beneath the boughs of Nan Elmoth, wrapped in the hush of a moment that stretched far beyond the reckoning of time. The wind no longer stirred the high branches. The stars seemed frozen in the black vault of the heavens, their light caught in the folds of Melian's silver robes. There was an air of quiet inevitability in the way she stood, as though she had always been here, waiting for this hour, for this meeting, for him. Thingol, who had walked the length and breadth of Beleriand, who had seen the peaks of Ered Luin crowned with their eternal frost, who had waded into the starlit waters of Cuiviénen in the days of the Eldar's awakening, he now found himself utterly undone. There were no words in the tongue of the Sindar, nor in the high speech of the Valar that could give voice to what unfurled in his heart. He had seen beauty before, of starlight upon the sea, of song rising in the halls of the Eldar, of the unfading glow of Telperion and Laurelin as the messengers of the Valar spoke of them in hushed reverence. But never had he known a beauty such as this, a beauty that was not a thing to be admired, but a force that reached inside him and reshaped the very fabric of his being. He opened his lips to speak, yet nothing came. He felt as if he had stepped beyond the world he knew, into some sacred realm where words were meaningless, where the air itself held the weight of some unspoken truth. His own thoughts tumbled within him like water over stone, reshaping themselves before they could even settle. At last she moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion, as if she too understood that this moment was more than an ordinary meeting. It was something that had been set in the pattern of Arda before even the world was made. Her gaze held his, unwavering, calm as the surface of a deep lake. "You have wandered long, Eloise," she said at last, her voice a thing not merely heard but felt, as though it sank into the marrow of his bones. "And you have sought many things. But tell me, what is it that you seek now?" Thingol drew in a breath, slow and uncertain. The sound of her voice had settled into him like the roots of an ancient tree finding purchase in the soil. He had always thought of himself as a prince of the Eldar, a leader of his people, a speaker of wisdom, but now, standing in her presence, he felt as a child standing before the first dawn, seeing the world truly for the first time. I sought a path," he said at last, his own voice unfamiliar to his ears, quiet and unsure, as though he no longer fully recognized himself. "A way forward, a place to lead my people, to shape a home for them beneath the light of the stars. But now," he faltered, his hand reaching out, though he dared not touch her, "now I do not know what it is I seek, for you have cast all else into shadow." Melian regarded him with eyes that held the depth of ages, eyes that had seen the foundations of the world, that had known the halls of the Valar, the harmony of the Ainur's first song. She did not answer at once, for she understood that silence too was a kind of music, that the weight of a pause could shape the meaning of words as surely as the breath between notes shaped a melody. At last she spoke, and her words were slow, each one settling upon the air like falling petals. "Paths are strange things, Eloise. Some are chosen, some are given, and some are found only when one ceases to seek them." Thingol's fingers curled slightly, his hand dropping back to his side. He did not know what she meant, not fully, not yet, but he felt that her words were not mere counsel, but something deeper, a lesson not yet understood. And then she smiled. It was a small thing, barely more than the faintest curve of her lips, but it was enough to break the tension that had held him still. In that moment, it was as if the air itself shifted, as though the trees of Nan Elmoth exhaled a breath they had long been holding, as though the stars above stirred once more upon their course. The world began again. A soft breeze moved through the glade, stirring the nightingales from their perches. Their voices rose, hesitant at first, then growing stronger, a chorus of liquid song spilling through the night. Melian lifted her chin slightly, and for the first time she stepped forward, closing the space between them until she stood within the orbit of his presence, near enough that he could feel the faint warmth of her, the shimmer of power that surrounded her like the unseen light of the two trees. "Elwë," she murmured, and the way she spoke his name made it sound like something new, something wholly remade. Your path has led you here, has it not? Then tell me, will you follow where it leads? Thingol swallowed, his throat tight. He did not know where this road would take him, but he knew with a certainty that went beyond thought or reason that he could not turn away. Where it leads, he echoed softly. He glanced up at the canopy above them, at the dark leaves shifting against the starlight, at the silver shadows spilling across the forest floor. Yes, yes, I will follow. And with those words, the world shifted. Not in a way that could be seen, nor in a way that could be measured, but deeply in the threads of time itself. Somewhere far away the Valar stirred, sensing the tremor of fate twisting into a new pattern. Somewhere in the deep halls of Angband, Morgoth frowned, though he knew not why, his shadowy thoughts brushing against an unseen force that eluded his grasp. For something had begun, something older than war, older than darkness, older than even the first song of creation, a love that would shape the fate of Middle-earth itself. For long years after, the people of the Sindar would speak of how their king was lost to them, how he vanished into the depths of Nan Elmoth and returned as something greater than he had been. They would say that when he emerged from that twilight forest, he was no longer merely Thingol, prince of the Sindar, but Elu-Thingol, the king of Doriath, and at his side walked a being of light and shadow, of song and power, of wisdom and grace. Melian, queen of the hidden realm. And beneath their rule the forests of Doriath flourished, and their borders were made strong, not by walls of stone nor by swords of steel, but by a power unseen, a power that even the Dark Lord himself would come to fear. But that fear, that power, was yet to be tested. For deep in the north the shadow of Morgoth brooded, and though he did not yet know it, the choices made beneath the boughs of Nan Elmoth had already sealed his doom. The years passed like a slow river, carving its path through stone, deliberate and unyielding, shaping the very land with its movement. And in the heart of Beleriand, nestled beneath a vast canopy of ancient trees, Doriath was woven into existence, not with the labor of hands, nor with the raising of walls, but with something deeper, something more potent. The enchantment of Melian, a power not seen before in Middle-earth. It was not mere sorcery that surrounded the hidden kingdom, nor was it simply a barrier against those who would intrude upon its peace. It was a song, a thought, a living will, binding the land in an embrace so profound that even the trees seemed to breathe with the weight of her presence. The rivers, once careless in their course, now moved with a purpose as though whispering among themselves, speaking of her power in ripples that caressed their banks. The winds that once wandered freely now lingered over the great forests, brushing through the leaves like fingers tracing the notes of an unseen melody. The very roots of the earth had learned her name. No being of shadow could pass the border of her realm unbidden, for the girdle of Melian was woven of something deeper than magic. It was the very essence of her will, drawn from the first song of the Ainur, bound into the fabric of the world itself. And yet, though it kept darkness at bay, it was not a prison nor a wall. It was a whisper, a suggestion to the air itself that nothing born of malice should set foot upon the sacred ground she had chosen to guard. And within that guarded land, Elu, Thingol, and Melian ruled together, as king and queen, as husband and wife, as two beings whose fates had been braided together in a way neither had foreseen, and yet neither would ever seek to undo. It was an unspoken truth, one that needed no confirmation in words, for it was written in the way they walked side by side beneath the trees, in the way Thingol's silver hair caught the starlight, and Melian's presence shimmered in the very air around her. They were two parts of a whole, though one had been born of the world and the other before it. And yet, for all the beauty of what they had built, Thingol could not silence the thoughts that sometimes crept upon him like shadows at the edge of a fire's glow. He had walked with the Eldar in their earliest days, had seen the Valar in their majesty, had stood upon the shores of Middle-earth and longed for the light of the West. He had known the wisdom of those who had seen the two trees before they fell, had spoken with those whose eyes had beheld the face of Manwë himself, and yet he had remained. There were nights when he would stand upon the borders of his land, his gaze drifting beyond the shimmering barrier that Melian had laid upon the land, staring into the unknown beyond. The darkness did not frighten him, not in the way it might frighten others, but there was something in the distant wind, something nameless, something unseen, that pressed against the walls of his heart. It was not the fear of war, nor the dread of Morgoth's shadow. It was the knowledge that he had chosen a different path than the one fate had perhaps intended for him. And Melian, who knew his heart as though it were written upon the wind, would stand beside him in the silence, waiting until his thoughts gathered themselves enough to take form in words. "You have been thinking of what lies beyond," she said one evening, her voice soft, her hands clasped before her as she gazed into the darkness that lingered beyond the girdle. "Of the lands beyond Doriath, of the war that stirs like a tide gathering itself before the storm." Thingol did not answer at first. He had learned long ago that there was no need for pretense with her, no use in weaving words to conceal his heart, for Melian did not listen simply to what was spoken. She listened to the spaces between words, to the silences that carried greater truths than any speech ever could. At last he exhaled, and his voice was quiet, thoughtful. "The world moves forward, whether we will it or not. The war in the north stirs ever closer, and the sons of Feanor carry within them an oath that will drive them to folly." He turned to look at her, his silver gaze searching hers. "And yet here, within these borders, all is still. Sometimes I wonder, have we removed ourselves too far from the tides of fate? Have we built a sanctuary only to close our eyes to what must come?" Melian did not speak immediately. Instead, she lifted her hand, her fingers brushing gently against the bark of a tree that stood beside them, its leaves catching the light of the stars, glowing faintly like silver fireflies. "Do you know why the trees grow as they do, Elu?" she asked, her voice soft, contemplative. "Why they reach skyward yet sink their roots so deep into the earth?" Thingol frowned slightly at the unexpected question, but he did not look away. "Because that is their nature, to seek the light yet hold to the earth." Melian nodded, and her fingers lingered upon the bark, her touch gentle as a whisper of wind. "They do not choose to do so. It is the way they were made. But we—" She turned her gaze back to him, her dark eyes luminous beneath a canopy of leaves. "We are not trees, bound to the earth by roots we cannot move. We may stand and we may reach, but we may also walk, and when we walk we leave behind the place we once stood. Thingol's lips parted slightly, his breath catching, for he understood her meaning. Fate had set him upon a path, but it had not bound him to it. He had chosen, he had followed, and in doing so he had left behind the light of the west, the summons of the Valar, the path that many of his kin had taken. You fear that in standing apart we have stepped away from the song that still shapes the world, Melian murmured, as though reading the thought from the air itself. But listen, Elu. She closed her eyes for a moment, and the wind shifted, carrying with it the distant sound of nightingales, the murmur of the river, the whisper of the leaves. The song has not forgotten us. It has simply changed. Thingol inhaled slowly, his eyes flickering as he listened. And there in the spaces between the sounds, he heard it. The distant echo of something vast, something ancient, something that moved not apart from them, but with them. The great song of the Ainur had not ceased. It had only adjusted, weaving them into it in a way he had not seen before. And in that moment, something in him settled. He lifted his hand and placed it over hers, where it rested against the tree, his fingers warm against hers. Then let us shape it, he said, his voice low but certain. Let us shape this part of the song as best we may. Melian's smile was quiet, and in the depths of her gaze there was something like understanding, for she knew that the world was shifting, that the war would one day reach even the gates of Doriath, and though Thingol did not yet know it, Morgoth had already turned his thoughts toward the hidden realm, seeking the power that he feared most. But for now the stars shone over the forest, and the song wove its way through the trees, shaping the fate of all that was to come. There are moments in the course of all things, quiet and unmarked by the weight of time, where fate tightens its unseen threads, where the world itself pauses to listen, as though the great symphony of its making lingers upon a single note before the melody shifts. In those moments, the air carries the tremor of things yet to come, and the winds bear whispers that not even the most far-sighted can fully grasp. And so it was in Doriath, as Melian walked among the glades of her kingdom, her hands brushing against the bark of trees that had grown tall and proud beneath her watchful gaze, the very earth beneath her feet thrumming softly, as though aware of the power that walked upon it. The light of the stars, undiminished by the yet unrisen sun, lay upon the leaves in cold silver gleams, turning each blade of grass into a thread of quiet fire. The river Escalduin moved in slow currents, its dark waters catching the light like a mirror that knew secrets too deep for words. The air was thick with the scent of moss and distant rain, a fragrance of something untouched, unspoiled, a world preserved in the hush of its own dreaming. And yet, beneath this peace, beneath the song that wove itself through the trees, there was something else, something that had begun to stir beyond the borders of the girdle, an unease in the bones of the world, a shifting of the shadows far to the north, where the darkness had never truly been vanquished. Melian paused in her steps, her gaze lifting toward the unseen distance, toward lands she had not walked in an age, She had long known that Doriath was not immune to the movements of the world, that her power, though vast, did not exist in a void. The ripples of fate extended beyond her reach, and she could feel the growing weight of them now, as though the fabric of time itself had begun to fray at its edges, woven too tightly around a fate it had not yet revealed. Behind her, Thingol watched her in silence, his silver-gray eyes thoughtful, his hands clasped behind him in that way of his when he was lost in thought. There had been many nights like this, where they walked together beneath the trees, saying little but understanding much, the quiet between them filled with more meaning than 1,000 spoken words. But tonight, there was something in the set of her shoulders, in the way she lifted her chin to the wind, that made him step forward, his voice low, thoughtful, heavy with the weight of what he had been pondering in his own heart. "You have felt it as well," he said at last, not as a question but as a quiet acknowledgement of something that had already settled between them. His voice was deep, a sound like stone shaping the air, measured and deliberate, but beneath it there was an edge of something else, concern perhaps, or contemplation, a king who weighed the unspoken against what he already knew. Melian did not look at him immediately. Instead, she allowed her fingers to linger against the smooth bark of the tree beside her, tracing the intricate patterns that nature had carved into it, as though listening to something beneath the surface. "There are tides," she murmured at last, her voice soft, distant, but not without weight. "Movements unseen, forces that stir beyond the knowing of most. The world turns, Elu, and its song is shifting." Thingol inhaled slowly, his gaze steady upon her. He had long since learned that when Melian spoke in such ways, it was not mere poetic musing, nor the idle riddles of those who sought to sound wise without true knowledge. She spoke as one who had seen the weaving of the great tapestry of Arda itself, as one who understood the currents beneath the surface of things, the silent pulse of fate that shaped the destinies of all who dwelt upon its shore. "And yet we do not know the melody it will take," he said, his voice quieter now, though no less firm. "What is it that you have seen, Melian? What is it that you have felt in the echoes of the world?" She turned to him then, and for a moment he saw the reflection of the stars in her gaze, as though her eyes held something vast, something far beyond the reach of even the wisest of the Eldar. "I have seen shadows moving where none should be," she said after a long pause. "I have felt the weight of a thought that does not belong to this land, something that presses against the edges of what has been woven here, as though searching for the places where it might unravel the threads." She exhaled, a breath so quiet it might have been mistaken for the rustling of leaves. "And I have felt a gaze, one that lingers upon us, though it does not yet reach." Thingol's expression darkened slightly, his jaw tightening. He did not need to ask whose gaze she meant, for there was only one being in Middle-earth whose malice could stretch beyond the borders of the lands he held in thrall: Morgoth. The name alone was enough to cast a shadow over any peace, and though his kingdom was far to the north, buried in the choking fumes of Angband, Thingol knew that his reach was long. "And yet," Thingol said slowly, "he does not strike. He watches, he waits, but he does not move against us." He frowned, his fingers tightening at his sides. "Why?" Melian's gaze did not waver. "Because he does not yet understand what he fears," she said, her voice soft but steady as the deep roots of the oldest trees. "And that is what frightens him the most." Thingol regarded her for a long moment, the words settling into him like stones dropped into still water, their ripples moving outward through his thoughts. He had always known that Melian was unlike any other, that her presence in Middle-earth was not merely that of a queen or a wife, nor even that of a Maya who had chosen to dwell among the children of Iluvatar. She was a power unto herself, something older, something deeper, something that even the Dark Lord himself had not accounted for. "You believe he watches because he does not understand you," he said at last, his voice quiet, considering. "I know it," she replied simply. "He has measured the strength of the Eldar. He has known the fire of Feanor's wrath, the cunning of his sons, the pride of the Noldor, the wisdom of the Valar, the war-wrought steel of the Edain. But he has never known me." She turned her gaze fully to him then, and in her eyes there was something vast, something deep as the sea and older than the mountains themselves. "And so he waits. He does not strike, for he does not yet know how." Thingol said nothing for a long moment, his mind turning over her words, his thoughts reaching out to touch the edges of something he could not yet fully grasp. The weight of what she had said settled over him, heavy and unshaken. For if Morgoth, the great enemy, the first betrayer, the master of all darkness, did not understand her, and that more than anything was a thing to consider, for fear in a mind such as Morgoth's was never a thing left unchallenged for long. And deep in the north, beneath the weight of a darkened sky, Morgoth sat upon his iron throne, and he frowned, though he knew not why. Far to the north, where the sky was a vault of endless ash and the ground lay barren and lifeless, where no birds wove their songs into the air and no rivers carried the whispers of the wind, there sat a throne of black iron, jagged and crude, a thing of might rather than beauty, of dominion rather than grace. Here beneath the vaulted halls of Angband, deep within the roots of the world where light had never touched and would never touch, Morgoth brooded in silence, the weight of his own dominion pressed down upon him. Though none of his servants would have dared to speak of such things aloud, the great halls of his fortress were vast, and yet they were stifling, the air thick with the stench of sulfur, of metal scorched by the fires of his forges, where the great weapons of his conquest were wrought in agony and toil. The sound of hammering echoed endlessly through the tunnels, the clang of iron upon iron, the labored breath of thralls who had long forgotten what it was to see the sky. But even the ceaseless churning of his war machine did not soothe him. He sat motionless upon his throne, one hand resting upon the armrest of dark stone, fingers curled as though grasping something unseen. His eyes, blacker than the abyss, stared into the gloom of his hall, yet his gaze was not upon the torches that flickered weakly against the cold air, nor upon the dark shapes that lingered beyond sight, creatures too fearful to move without his will. He was looking beyond Angband, beyond the lands he had claimed, beyond even the mountains that walled his dominion from the world. He was looking toward Doriath. A frown creased his brow, deep as a chasm carved by ages of ice and fire. He did not know why, but something there unsettled him, a thing that he could not name, a presence that resisted all understanding, and this This was what angered him most of all. For Morgoth, who had walked among the Ainur before the shaping of the world, who had seen the great song woven before time began, who had rebelled against the very fabric of creation itself, feared nothing that he understood. But this was something he did not understand. Slowly, deliberately, he shifted upon his throne, his great form casting long shadows across the walls, shadows that seemed to writhe of their own accord, bending beneath his presence. "What is she?" he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper. Yet it carried through the vast chamber, low and cold, sinking into the very stone of Angband. It was a question he had asked before, but now it carried weight, an urgency that had begun to press against the edges of his mind. No one answered him, and yet he had not expected an answer. Still, the silence that followed was thick, heavy with unspoken things. His minions, those wretched and trembling things that served him in fear, dared not move, dared not even breathe too loudly in his presence. They knew the dangers of speaking when he had not called upon them, and they knew even better the dangers of remaining silent when he demanded their counsel. At last, a voice, slithering through the darkness like a thing unwelcome, Sauron, his most trusted lieutenant, and yet trusted only in so far as one trusts a serpent that coils at one's feet. The voice was smooth, deliberate, a thing measured, as though its speaker was choosing each word as a stone carefully placed in a tower that might collapse at any moment. "She is but one Maya, my lord," Sauron said, stepping forward, his form still shrouded in shadow, the edges of his presence shifting like the flickering of flame. "She is no greater than I, nor any more dangerous than those who once served the Valar in the West, and yet you speak of her as though she were something beyond the reach of your will." Morgoth's gaze did not shift. He did not so much as move, and yet the air around him grew heavier, as though the fortress itself had drawn breath and held it, waiting. "Then tell me, Lieutenant," Morgoth murmured at last, his voice calm, impossibly so, the kind of stillness that came before the breaking of a storm. "Why is it that my will does not touch her? Why is it that the very land she walks upon resists my shadow?" Sauron did not answer immediately, but there was a subtle shift in his stance, a minute hesitation that might have gone unnoticed by any but Morgoth, a sign that the question was not as simple as he would have liked it to be. At last, after a silence that stretched like a blade between them, Sauron inclined his head slightly, a gesture of deference, but there was something else there. Curiosity, calculation, the quiet hunger of a mind that had never ceased to seek power, even beneath the dominion of a greater will. "She has woven herself into the land," he said at last, his voice smooth, considering. "Not merely through spell or charm, but in a way that is deeper, more intrinsic. The trees bend to her song, the rivers speak her name, the very air carries the echo of her will. She does not rule Doriath as one who holds dominion over it. She is Doriath, and thus it resists us as though it were not merely land but a living thing." Morgoth was silent for a long moment. The shadows stretched, reaching like unseen fingers across the walls, moving as though restless beneath the weight of thought. "She is of the Ainur," he said at last, his voice so low it was almost lost beneath the flickering torches. and yet she has made herself something else. She has become part of the song in a way that was not foreseen. This is why she unsettles me." Sauron lifted his chin slightly, his eyes gleaming faintly beneath the hood of darkness that clung to him. "If she is merely another Maya, then she can be broken," he said, his tone carrying the quiet edge of a blade hidden beneath silk. "All things that live can break. All things that think can be unraveled. There are ways." Morgoth exhaled slowly, and when he spoke, his words were quiet, yet heavy enough to shape the course of all things that would come. "Then find them." And deep within the halls of Angband, the forges burned hotter, the hammers struck harder, and the whisper of unseen things began to coil through the air, for a shadow had begun to stretch toward the girdle of Melian, though it had not yet found a way to cross it. Not yet, but soon. The air in Doriath was always thick with something unseen, something that wove itself between the trees, between the shifting currents of the Escalgaudun, between the stars that glowed above like silent sentinels. It was not merely the enchantment of the girdle, nor the lingering echoes of the Ainur's first song that shaped the world. It was something older, something felt rather than known, and on nights such as this, when the leaves barely stirred and the scent of the river mingled with the crispness of the coming autumn, it seemed as if the entire forest held its breath, listening, waiting for something that had not yet arrived. Melian walked among the shadows of the trees, her form bathed in the pale silver light that filtered through the high canopy above. She moved with a grace that defied the weight of time, her steps soundless upon the moss-covered earth, and though she was bound to flesh, there was something of the ethereal in the way she seemed to shimmer, as if her presence belonged to two worlds at once. She was deep in thought, her mind drifting along currents unseen, reaching beyond the veil of her own realm, beyond the borders she had woven into the land, seeking something distant, something that trembled at the edges of her perception. She could feel it, like the faintest echo of a distant storm, the weight of an unseen gaze, the pressure of something lurking just beyond the threshold of her sight. It was subtle, barely more than a breath against the fabric of her will, but she knew it was there, and she knew who it belonged to. Morgoth. He had begun to watch her in earnest now, no longer as a distant curiosity, no longer as an idle amusement, but as a question he could not answer, a force he could not comprehend, and it unsettled him. She knew this not because she had peered into the depths of his mind. She had no desire to let such darkness touch her own thoughts, but because the very air around her carried the weight of his growing frustration. He had cast his shadow over many lands, had bent many wills to his own, and yet here he found something that would not yield, a presence that defied him not with swords, not with the cries of armies, but with a silence so absolute that it rang like the clearest of notes in a song only she could hear. She had spoken little of this to Thingol, not because she wished to keep it from him, but because there were some truths that could not be explained, only felt. And though he was wise beyond the measure of his kin, though he had walked the long road of years and had seen many wonders, he did not know what it was to bear the weight of the Ainur's song in his very being, to have the fabric of Arda itself woven into the essence of his will. But tonight, as she stood upon the high terrace of Menegroth, overlooking the endless sea of trees that stretched beyond the river, she heard the quiet steps of her husband approaching behind her, and she knew it was time to speak. "You are troubled." His voice was measured, deep as the roots of the mountains, yet carrying a gentleness that only she had ever truly seen in him. He was a king, a ruler of the Sindar, and his voice was one that had commanded great hosts, that had held the loyalty of thousands, but here, with her, he did not speak as a king. He spoke as a man who had built his world beside hers, who had given his heart to something far older than himself. Melian did not turn at once. She let his words settle, let the silence between them stretch just enough to give weight to what was left unspoken. Finally she exhaled, a breath that carried something unspoken, something that lingered in the air like mist over still waters. "The world is shifting," she murmured, her gaze still upon the distant trees. "The tides of fate are pulling upon the threads of all things, and even here, where the girdle holds strong, I can feel them pressing against the borders. There are eyes upon us, Elu." She turned then, her dark gaze meeting his, and though her voice was soft, there was no mistaking the gravity in it. His eyes. Thingol's jaw tightened slightly, and though he did not speak at once, she could see the flicker of understanding in his expression, the way his thoughts turned over her words, weighing them, searching them for what lay beneath. He had long suspected as much, had felt in his own way that Doriath was no longer merely a hidden kingdom, but a place of consequence, a force upon the great board of the world's fate. But to hear it spoken, to know that Morgoth himself had begun to take notice, that was something else entirely. "Then let him watch," Thingol said at last, his voice steady, resolute, though there was an edge of something deeper in it, something more than defiance. "Let him wonder. Let him waste his thoughts on us while the world moves beyond his grasp. He is far from us, and his reach does not yet extend beyond the mountains." Melian studied him, her gaze unreadable, though there was a quiet sorrow in her eyes, one that only a being of her nature could bear. "You speak as though distance is what holds him at bay," she said gently, "as though walls and mountains, rivers and trees are what keep us beyond his reach. But he is no mere king, Elu. He does not build his kingdom with stone, nor with armies alone. His dominion is one of will, of thought, of slow, creeping shadow that does not break against gates, but seeps through the cracks beneath them." Thingol exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for a moment, his fingers tightening at his sides. He understood what she meant, though it was not a truth he wished to dwell upon. He had spent long years building Doriath into a place of sanctuary, of safety, of peace, in a world that was darkening beyond its borders. And yet, even here the shadow was stirring, reaching, though its hands had not yet found purchase. "What would you have me do?" he asked at last, lifting his gaze to hers once more. "We cannot march against him. We cannot meet him as the Noldor do with swords and fire, nor can we drive him back with the strength of our arms alone. The girdle holds, and within it our people are safe. But if you say that is not enough, then tell me, Melian, What must be done? Melian was silent for a long moment. Then, at last, she stepped forward, reaching out to take his hand in hers, her fingers cool against his own. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet, yet filled with a certainty that could not be mistaken. We do not fight shadow with steel, Ilu. We do not answer fire with fire. We do not meet him upon the field of war, nor do we let him dictate the shape of our fear. We endure. We stand. We shape the song of this land not in answer to him, but in defiance of him. That is how we fight. Thingol closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, letting her words sink into him. And when he opened them again, there was something resolved in his gaze, something that had not been there before. Then we endure, he said softly, and far to the north, where the sky was ever black, where the halls of Angband trembled with the weight of their master's malice, Morgoth frowned, though he knew not why, for something in the world had shifted, something that defied even his sight. And he did not yet understand that it was not the shape of the world that had changed, but the song that wove it together. The night deepened over Doriath, spreading its vast cloak over the silent trees, and the air, thick with the fragrance of damp earth and the distant murmur of the Escalduin, carried a hush that was both peace and portent. The silver leaves of the great beeches shimmered faintly, reflecting the cold light of the stars like scattered fragments of moonlight, swaying only slightly in the hush of the still air. And beneath them, where the roots of the earth ran deep and the song of the land moved in quiet currents unseen, Melian walked alone, her steps slow, deliberate, each motion attuned to something far beyond the mere act of movement. She was not restless. No, hers was a stillness that carried purpose, a silence filled with a depth of thought that stretched far beyond the walls of her kingdom, beyond even the borders of Middle-earth itself. The river, ever a whispering presence in these woods, carried its voice through the night, a song of endless passage, of time slipping through unseen fingers, of days long past and days yet to come. Melian paused at its banks, her gaze drifting over the water's surface, watching how the stars rippled and reformed with each quiet movement of the current. She listened, not merely with her ears, but with something deeper, something bound to the very essence of the world. And what she heard was not mere water, not mere wind, not merely the breath of the leaves or the stirring of small creatures in the underbrush. It was something else, something beyond words. There was a weight upon the air, a presence felt rather than seen, as though the world itself had drawn in a slow breath and had yet to exhale. It was not a sound, nor a whisper, nor even the faintest tremor against the edges of her perception, but it was there, a shadow that had not yet fallen, a thought yet unspoken, a storm whose winds had not yet begun to stir, and yet whose coming was already written upon the sky. She did not need to turn when she heard the measured footsteps behind her, for she had already known he was near. Thingol's presence was something she had come to know as she knew the trees, as she knew the song of the night itself. A part of this place, a thing woven into its very being. And yet she also knew the weight in his steps tonight, the careful way he moved, the thoughts that stirred in him as a river stirs before the first break of ice. For a long moment he said nothing, only stood at her side looking out over the waters, his gaze lost in the shifting reflections. And in that silence, Melian felt the quiet tension that lay beneath his stillness, the way his thoughts pressed against the edges of words, unspoken yet restless. At last, after what seemed an age, he spoke, and his voice was low, quiet, heavy with thought. "There is something I do not understand," he murmured, his gaze still on the water, his arms folded across his chest as though bracing himself against the weight of something unseen. "I have known fear before, Melian. I have seen darkness rise, have fought against the tides of fate, have known the dread of war and the sorrow it brings. But this," he exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening against his arm, "this is not fear, and yet I feel its shape pressing against the edges of thought, a shadow whose form I cannot see. I feel it in the air, in the stillness of the woods, in the way the stars seem distant, though they have not moved. And I know—" Here he turned his head slightly, his gaze falling on her, seeking something, though what it was he could not name. "I know that you have felt it too." Melian did not answer at once. Instead, she let the silence stretch again, let the night itself seem to breathe around them. There were truths that could not be spoken swiftly, truths that could not be shaped into mere words without losing something of their weight. At last she spoke, and her voice was soft, yet filled with something vast, something that stretched beyond the moment they stood in. "There are currents in the world, Elu," she said, turning her gaze back to the river. "They move beneath the surface of all things, unseen, unfelt by most, yet shaping the world nonetheless. Some are small, no more than ripples, the echoes of choices made and paths walked, but others are deep, vast as the sea, tides that have been moving since the first days, currents that shape the fate of kingdoms, of peoples, of the world itself. And this," she reached out, her fingertips brushing the surface of the water, watching as the ripples spread outward, distorting the stars into wavering fragments of light. "This is such a tide." Thingol was silent for a moment, his thoughts turning over her words, feeling their weight settle within him like stones sinking into deep water. He had always known that Melian saw beyond what he could see, that her sight was not bound to the mere present, nor even to the knowledge of what had come before. She saw into the very fabric of things, into the song that wove the world together, and where others could only listen to its melody, she could feel the notes before they were sung. "You believe something is coming," he said at last, his voice steady, though there was an edge of quiet tension beneath it, a careful bracing against what he already knew to be true. Melian inclined her head slightly. "It is already moving," she said softly. "It is not here yet, not fully, but it is coming, and when it does, it will seek to unravel what has been woven here." Thingol exhaled, his gaze dark, his thoughts turning inward. He did not need to ask what she meant. He already knew. Morgoth. He had watched, had waited, had measured Doriath from afar, and now he had begun to move in ways unseen, seeking, testing, searching for a way to break what had been built here. And yet, Thingol murmured, his eyes narrowing slightly as he turned his gaze back to her. You do not seem afraid. Melian smiled then, a small, quiet thing, a smile that carried something deeper than mere reassurance, something ancient, something knowing. I have walked this world before its making, Elu, she said, and though her voice was soft, it carried with it a weight that could not be denied. I have seen the light before it was cast upon the waters, have sung the song before it was shaped into being. And I know this. Morgoth does not understand what he fears. That is why he waits. That is why he watches. Because he does not yet know how to break what he does not comprehend. Thingol studied her for a long moment, his thoughts turning over her words, feeling their meaning settle within him. And though he did not speak at once, something in him steadied. At last he reached out, taking her hand in his fingers warm against hers, his grip firm. Then let him wait, he said, his voice quiet but filled with something resolute. Let him watch. Let him waste his thoughts in wondering. We will stand, Melian. We will endure. And far to the north, where the black halls of Angband stretched deep into the bones of the world, Morgoth stirred upon his throne, his fingers tightening, his gaze narrowing, though he did not know why. For the song was shifting, bending around something he could not yet see, something woven into the world itself, a thread he could not break. Not yet, but soon, far to the north, where the sky was a deep and bruised expanse of cloud-choked darkness, where the land was barren and blackened beneath the weight of endless winter, where the very bones of the world seemed steeped in silence save for the distant growl of forges deep within the mountains, Morgoth sat upon his throne, and for the first time in many ages he contemplated something he did not understand. The great halls of Angband stretched endlessly into shadow, vast and cold, built not with beauty nor wisdom, but with dominion in mind, raised through fire and pain, shaped by the will of one who had long cast aside all thought of harmony or balance. The walls loomed like prison bars against the sky, the iron doors heavy with the weight of war, and the very air stank of soot, of blood, of the labor of creatures who knew no rest. This was a place of conquest, of eternal war-making, of shadows given form and substance, and yet it was not enough. Morgoth's mind stretched beyond these walls, beyond the reach of his physical dominion, seeking, searching, always pushing against the edges of what was, testing the fabric of the world like fingers pressing upon the strings of a harp to find where they were weakest, and yet in Doriath the strings did not bend. They did not even tremble. That was what unsettled him. It was not that the borders of the forest resisted him. Many lands had done so before, though none had held out forever. It was not that Thingol ruled his people well. Many kings had thought themselves secure before the tide of Morgoth's will had risen to drown them. It was not even that the elves of Doriath had a strength about them that other kindreds did not possess. Strength could be broken, could be twisted, could be reforged in the fires of fear or despair. No, it was something else entirely. Something unseen, something unnamed. Melian, even now, though his mind reached toward her, though he sent his thoughts creeping like dark fingers over the edges of her realm, seeking, prying, pressing against the fabric of her presence, he could find no place where he might slip through, no crack through which his influence might seep. It was like pressing against the edge of the world itself, as if she were not merely a presence within Doriath, but a force woven into its very being, a presence that was not only aware of his touch, but that rejected it before it could even take root. Morgoth clenched his hand upon the armrest of his throne, the black iron groaning beneath the pressure of his grip, and his narrowed eyes flickered toward the figure standing just beyond the reach of the torchlight. Sauron. The lieutenant stood still, his form wrapped in shadow, his expression unreadable, but Morgoth could feel the weight of his unspoken thoughts, the calculations that ran beneath his surface like a river running beneath ice. He had served well. For all his treachery, for all his quiet ambitions, he had a mind that understood the shaping of wills, the bending of thoughts, the weaving of deceptions that could unmake empires. But even Sauron, for all his cunning, had not yet unraveled this mystery. "She is only one," Morgoth said at last, his voice a slow, deliberate thing, low as the grinding of stone, deep as the abyss of time. "Amaya, like you, like those who once bowed to the Valar before the folly of their rebellion. And yet, though I reach, though I watch, she remains beyond me." His eyes darkened, his fingers tightening further, his voice falling to a quiet growl. "Why?" Sauron did not answer at once. He was careful, always careful, for he knew that to speak too swiftly before Morgoth was to invite wrath, just as to hesitate too long was to invite suspicion. But at last, after a measured pause, he stepped forward, his head tilting ever so slightly as he regarded his master. "You have measured her power against what you have known before," he said, his voice smooth, careful, his words slipping through the air like whispers that might coil in the mind long after they were spoken. "Against the Valar, who wielded the might of the world's first shaping. Against the Eldar, who hold the wisdom of the ages in their song. Against the lesser Maiar, who move unseen in the winds and the waters, shaping the world in ways that do not trouble the great lords of the earth." He paused, his gaze flickering, his voice lowering. "But you have not measured her power against something else, something older, something more dangerous." Morgoth's eyes flashed, and though he did not move, the air in the chamber grew heavy, pressing down like the weight of an unseen storm. "And what," he said, his voice edged with quiet menace, "do you believe that to be?" Sauron met his gaze then, his own eyes gleaming like embers beneath the hood of shadow that clung to him. "She does not rule as we do," he murmured, his tone almost contemplative, as though speaking thoughts he had only just begun to unravel himself. "She does not command as the Valar did, nor does she wield her will as the Eldar wield their steel. She does not seek dominion, nor does she seek to bend the world to her design. And yet, the world bends around her all the same." Morgoth's fingers stilled upon the throne, his gaze sharpening, though he did not interrupt. Sauron took another measured step forward, his voice lowering even further. You have sought to grasp the power that rules the world, my lord. You have sought to break it, to twist it, to make it your own. And yet, this power... Sauron exhaled, and for the first time something like a flicker of unease passed through his otherwise measured voice. This power, it does not answer to you. It does not bow to force. It does not yield to fear. It does not break beneath the weight of war. Because it is not of war, nor of fire, nor of shadow. It is something else entirely. Morgoth's expression darkened, though he remained still, a mountain before a gathering storm. He had long suspected this truth, but had never heard it spoken aloud. He had seen power wielded in countless forms, through destruction, through subjugation, through the bending of will and the breaking of bodies, through the reshaping of the very earth beneath his feet. But Melian's power was something different, something that could not be unmade, as the works of the Eldar were unmade, something that could not be twisted as the hearts of men were twisted. And that was what infuriated him the most, for power that could not be broken was power that could not be controlled. Sauron continued, stepping yet closer, his voice dropping to something almost reverent. She does not command, and yet the land itself obeys. She does not conquer, and yet the trees, the rivers, the winds, they move at her will. She does not raise her voice in war, and yet even the shadow recoils before her presence. My lord, she is not a queen, she is not a ruler, she is not a warlord, nor a sorceress, nor even a Maya as you once knew them. Morgoth's fingers curled upon the blackened iron of his throne, but he did not speak, waiting, watching. Sauron lifted his chin ever so slightly, his voice barely above a whisper now. She is a keeper of things that cannot be undone, a force that preserves rather than destroys. She does not hold her power as a weapon, and that is why it cannot be taken from her. It is part of the world itself, not something shaped by hands, nor even by the thought of the Ainur. It is something that exists because it must. Morgoth's jaw tightened, his gaze burning with something deeper than anger, something far more dangerous, understanding. For he saw now fully the truth that had evaded him for so long. Melian's power was not magic, it was not sorcery, it was not even the might of the Ainur who had sung the world into being. It was older, it was deeper. It was something that could not be unraveled because it had never been woven. It had simply always been. And though he, the greatest of the Valar, the first among the Ainur, the one who had cast his will against the very fabric of creation itself, had sought to bend the world to his desire, this was something beyond his reach. A force of harmony, a force of wholeness, and wholeness was the one thing he had never been able to break. There was a long silence in the great hall of Angband, the air thick with something unspoken, something that pressed upon even the torches lining the walls, their flames flickering uneasily as though they, too, felt the weight of this revelation. And at last Morgoth rose from his throne, his movements slow, deliberate, the sound of his armor shifting like the groan of a world upon its axis. His form was vast, his shadow stretching like a living thing, and though he was still, the room seemed to tremble with the force of his presence. "She is bound to the song," he said at last, his voice low, quiet, dangerous. "But not as we were." Sauron did not answer. He did not need to. Morgoth's gaze turned, distant, searching through the unseen currents of the world, reaching, feeling, testing against the fabric of things. And though he could not yet touch her, though her presence remained beyond his grasp, he knew now why he had not been able to break her will. Because Melian was not merely a power in Middle-earth. She was not merely a Maya who had descended among the children of Ilúvatar. She was a force older than any empire, stronger than any army, a presence that made itself known not through conquest, but through the mere fact of its being. She was something that even he, in all his wisdom, could not unmake, and for the first time in long ages, Morgoth turned away. He did not command an assault upon Doriath. He did not send forth his legions, nor his fire, nor his endless hunger for destruction, because he knew to cross that border would be to stand before something he could not unright. To cross that border would be to face a power even he feared. And far to the south, where the forests of Doriath lay quiet beneath the silver sky, where the river Escalduin flowed in eternal song, where the leaves whispered secrets only the wise could hear, Melian stood upon the threshold of her kingdom and gazed into the distant dark. She did not smile, nor did she speak, for she knew that, though he had turned away for now, Morgoth had learned something this night, and that knowledge would change the course of Middle-earth forever. The forests of Doriath stretched endlessly beneath the dome of the night, vast and untouched, their emerald boughs shimmering beneath the pale glow of the stars. A hush lay upon the land, but it was not the silence of fear, nor of waiting, nor of dread. It was the silence of something vast, something sacred, something eternal. The deep stillness of a world that knew it was protected, not by walls, nor by weapons, nor by warriors standing watch upon the edges of a battlefield, but by a power that could not be seen, only felt. The wind moved gently through the high branches, rustling the silver leaves like whispers upon the fabric of time, as if the trees themselves murmured secrets that had never been spoken aloud. The river Escalduin, dark and smooth as glass, wound its way through the heart of the land, its waters gleaming where the light of the stars caught them, flowing with the quiet, steady song of a thing that had seen ages pass, empires rise and fall, and yet had never ceased its course. And there, at the heart of this realm, in the great halls of Menegroth, where stone had been shaped into beauty beyond the making of any mortal hand, Melian stood, her gaze distant, her thoughts stretching far beyond the limits of the walls that surrounded her. She knew. She had felt it, far to the north, beyond the mountains that walled Angband in its prison of fire and shadow, beyond the scorched earth where nothing green had grown in an age, beyond the black towers that clawed toward the sky like the broken bones of the world, Morgoth had turned away. He had watched. He had sought. He had reached. And now, at last, he had understood. She closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly, letting the weight of this knowledge settle over her like a river settling into its banks. The danger had not passed, it never would, not fully. But the greatest war, the war of will, the war of thought, the war of understanding, that had been won. Morgoth had faced something he could not break, could not bend, could not unmake, and he had turned aside, because even he knew better than to challenge something he could not comprehend. And yet, though she had always known this moment would come, though she had always known that one day he would try to pierce the veil of her power, to grasp at the edges of what he did not understand, there was no triumph in her heart, no exultation in knowing that she had forced the Dark Lord himself to retreat. There was only the quiet weight of inevitability, the knowledge that this victory was not the end, only the shifting of one thread in a song that had not yet finished its course. Footsteps echoed behind her, soft, deliberate, a presence that she knew as she knew the breath of the wind, as she knew the movement of the stars above, as she knew the river's song. Thingol. He had spoken little since their last conversation beneath the trees, since she had told him what she had felt moving beyond the borders of Doriath, since she had explained, in the way that only she could, that they were being watched. But now, as he came to stand beside her, his gaze searching hers, she saw in his silver-gray eyes that he knew. He had felt it in his own way. For though Thingol was not of the Ainur, though he had not been present when the world was first sung into being, though his power was not like hers, he was no fool. He was no child walking blind in the darkness. He was a king, a ruler, one who had seen many ages pass, and though his wisdom was bound to the earth rather than to the timeless echoes of the song, he understood what it meant when a shadow that had once lingered upon the edges of thought had suddenly withdrawn. "You felt it," he said at last, his voice low, steady, yet carrying the quiet tension of a man who did not yet know if the battle had truly passed or if the next storm already loomed upon the horizon. Melian turned her gaze back toward the trees, watching how the light of the stars caught upon the edges of the leaves, turning them to silver, watching how the wind moved through the boughs, stirring them like ripples upon the surface of a great sea. "Yes," she murmured, her voice soft, yet filled with something vast, something deep, something that could not be fully spoken in words. He knows now. He understands. Thingol was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, carefully, he exhaled. "And yet, he does not strike." Melian closed her eyes, letting the air settle around them, feeling the weight of the world move in unseen currents, shifting, changing, adjusting itself in the way that only she could perceive. "No," she said at last, opening her eyes again, gazing out over the endless forest. "Because he does not dare." Thingol studied her for a long moment, his thoughts moving like slow tides, rolling over the meaning of her words, the weight they carried. He was a king, a warrior, a leader of his people, and he had spent long years shaping Doriath into a realm that could withstand the tides of war, of fate, of the changing ages. But this was not a victory won by the sword. Morgoth had turned away, not because he had been defeated, but because he had been made to see that there was nothing to defeat. Melian's power was not the power of war, nor of conquest, nor of force. It was not something that could be unmade because it had never been built. It was something deeper, older, something woven into the fabric of the world itself, a thing that had no beginning and no end, something beyond the reach of even the mightiest of the Valar. And Morgoth had learned fear. He had learned that there were things even he could not unwrite, that there were forces in the world that did not answer to him, that there were walls he could not break, not because they were made of stone, but because they were not walls at all, but something far older and far greater. For what he feared was not Melian's strength, but her presence, not her might, but her will, not the borders she had placed around Doriath, but the knowledge that even beyond them she would endure, unbroken, untouched, untouchable. And so he had turned away. For all his armies, for all his fire, for all his dominion over the blackened lands of the north, he had been faced with something he could not undo, and he had chosen to let it be. Thingol exhaled once more, turning his gaze away from the trees, away from the night, looking instead at Melian, watching her as one watches the sea, vast and endless and unknowable, and yet constant. "Then it is done," he said at last, not as a question, but as a quiet recognition of the truth that lay between them. Melian smiled then, just slightly, just enough that it was almost unseen. She reached out, taking his hand in hers, her fingers cool, steady, strong. "For now," she said simply, "for now." And far away, in the depths of Angband, Morgoth sat upon his throne, and he did not speak. For the first time in all his long ages of dominion, he had turned away from something he could not conquer. And though he did not yet know it, though he would never name it, though he would never speak of it to those who followed him, he had been afraid.